Hello there. Find a comfortable spot. Close your eyes and take a deep, slow breath. Together, we will step into the world of Pride and Prejudice, where peaceful afternoons in the English countryside and gentle stories of love, family, and quiet secrets await you. Let the steady voice guide you into sleep, as each word and sentence of Jane Austen lulls you into a calm and restful night.
Pride and Prejudice, Chapter 19. The next day opened a new scene at Longbourn. Mr. Collins made his declaration in form, having resolved to do it without loss of time, as his leave of absence extended only to the following Saturday, and having no feelings of diffidence to make him wish for a longer delay, he set about it in the most orderly manner, with all the observances of form which he considered necessary. While Mrs. Bennet was dressing her daughters, he came to the breakfast parlor, where they were all assembled, and began with solemn composure as follows. Open quote. May I hope, madam, for your interest with your fair daughter Elizabeth, when I solicit for the honor of a private audience with her in the course of this morning. How? Close quote. Before Elizabeth had time for anything but a blush of surprise, Mrs. Bennet answered instantly. Open quote. Oh dear, yes, certainly. I am sure Lizzie will be very happy. I'm sure she can have no objection. Come, Kitty, I want you upstairs. Close quote. And gathering her work together, she was hastening away when Elizabeth called out. Open quote. Dear madam, do not go. I beg you will not go. Mr. Collins must excuse me. He can have nothing to say to me that anybody need not hear. I am going away myself. Close quote. Open quote. No nonsense, Lizzie. I desire you to stay where you are. Close quote. And upon Elizabeth seeming really, with vexed and embarrassed looks, about to escape, she added, Open quote. Lizzie, I insist upon your staying and hearing Mr. Collins. Close quote. Elizabeth would not oppose such authority, and sat down again. Mrs. Bennet and Kitty walked off, and as soon as they were gone, Mr. Collins began. Open quote. Believe me, my dear Miss Elizabeth, your modesty, so far from doing you any disservice, rather adds to your other perfections. You would have been less amiable in my eyes had there not been this little unwillingness. But allow me to assure you that I have your respected mother's permission for this address, and you need not be under any apprehension of her disapprobation. Close quote. Open quote. My reasons for marrying are, first, that I think it a right thing for every clergyman in easy circumstances, like myself, to set the example of matrimony in his parish. Secondly, that I am convinced it will add very greatly to my happiness. And thirdly, which perhaps I ought to have mentioned earlier, that it is the particular advice and recommendation of a very noble lady whom I have the honor of calling patroness. Twice has she condescended to give me her opinion, unasked too, on this subject, and it was the very words, Mr. Collins, you must marry. Choose properly, choose a gentlewoman for my sake, and for your own let her be an active, useful sort of person, not brought up high, but able to make a small income go a good way. Close quote. Open quote. My situation in life, my connections with the family of de Bourgh, and my relationship to your own, are circumstances highly in my favor, and you may be assured that when I am settled at Hunsford, I shall make no small figure in the world. Close quote. Elizabeth could hardly help laughing as she assured him that she was very sensible of the honor of his proposals, but that it was impossible for her to do otherwise than to decline them. Open quote. I am not now to learn, replied Mr. Collins, with a formal wave of the hand, that it is usual with young ladies to reject the addresses of the man whom they secretly mean to accept when he first applies for their favor, and that sometimes the refusal is repeated a second or even a third time. I am therefore by no means discouraged by what you have just said, and shall hope to lead you to the altar ere long. Close quote. Open quote. Upon my word, sir, cried Elizabeth, your hope is rather an extraordinary one after my declaration. I am perfectly serious in my refusal. You could not make me happy, and I am convinced that I am the last woman in the world who could make you so. Let me assure you of my esteem for you, but to accept your proposal is absolutely impossible. Close quote. Mr. Collins made a most dignified bow. Open quote. You are uniformly charming, said he. And I am persuaded that when your mother comes to talk to you on the subject, you will be more reasonable. I am by no means discouraged by what you have said. It is the established custom of your sex to reject a man on the first application, and perhaps you have now said as much to encourage my suit as would be consistent with propriety. Close quote. Elizabeth's astonishment was beyond expression. She began seriously to fear that he must be quite incapable of understanding her. Open quote. Sir, she cried, I am not one of those young ladies, if such young ladies there are, who are so daring as to risk their happiness on the chance of being asked a second time. I am perfectly serious in my refusal. You could not make me happy, and I am convinced that I am the last woman in the world who could make you so. Do not consider me now as an elegant female intending to plague you, but as a rational creature speaking the truth from her heart. Close quote. Open quote. You are then resolved to have me refuse you again? He said. I am sure that my attentions have been too marked to be mistaken. I have singled you out as the companion of my future life, but you positively refuse me. Very well. I am not now in a humor to insist upon it, though I could wish to have it otherwise, but I shall choose to attribute this refusal to your wish of increasing my love by suspense, according to the usual practice of elegant females. Close quote. And he was leaving the room gravely with an air of formality when Mrs. Bennet opened the door and entered. Open quote. Lizzie, Lizzie, what are you thinking of? Cried her mother. Mr. Collins, you must give me leave to speak to my child alone. Close quote. Elizabeth instantly left the room. Open quote. Oh, Mr. Collins, said Mrs. Bennet, you are too hasty. You must give her time to consider. She knows not her own interest when she refuses such an offer. I am sure she will change her mind when she sees how much it will please me. We shall very soon settle it, I am sure. Close quote. Mr. Collins replied that he had no doubt of her daughter's returning her affections with grateful delight, and that he should wait her reconsideration at her leisure. Mrs. Bennet would not be prevailed on to call her daughter again, and Mr. Collins, having satisfied himself that Lizzie's obstinacy was not to be overcome by a single refusal, determined that she should have time to think, and therefore took his leave for the present. When Elizabeth entered her father's library, she told him what had happened. He listened in silence and then said, open quote, An unhappy alternative is before you, Elizabeth. From this day you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do. Close quote. Elizabeth could not help but laugh, and her father's decision put an end to all further entreaty from her mother. Mr. Collins was not left long to the silent contemplation of his successful love, for Mrs. Bennet, having dawdled about in the vestibule to watch for the end of the conference, no sooner saw Elizabeth open the door and depart than she entered the parlor and found him with a look of disappointment. Mrs. Bennet, who always considered it as her duty to promote the establishment of her daughters, could not see him without feelings which moved her to a most cordial reception. Open quote. My dear Mr. Collins, said she, let me congratulate you on having taken so delightful a young woman by surprise. I do not doubt but that she will accept you very soon. Everything now depends upon her father's consent, and I am sure he will make no difficulty in it. Close quote, open quote. Oh, do not be too sure of that, said Mr. Bennet, for Elizabeth is a very headstrong, foolish girl, and does not know her own interest. But I will make her come to reason. Mr. Collins, you must excuse her. She is a very good sort of girl, and I will speak to her myself. Close quote. Open quote. Indeed, Mr. Bennet, replied Mr. Collins, I am far from accusing her of cruelty at present. I do not doubt her refusing me once or twice will add to her desire for my acceptance, when I am encouraged by yourself and her amiable mother to renew my addresses. Close quote. Close quote. Mrs. Bennet was, of course, too happy to oppose such an argument, and she was eagerly calling out for her husband when Elizabeth entered the room. Open quote. Lizzie, said her mother, your father wants you in the library. Come, Mr. Collins, you shall hear what he says. Close quote. Elizabeth was forced to go, though unwillingly, for she dreaded what her father might say. As she entered the library, Mr. Bennet said, open quote, come here, child. I have been considering your mother's desires and Mr. Collins's proposals, and have concluded that you must be married to one of them. Close quote. Elizabeth could hardly keep her countenance. Open quote. Let me hear what you have to say, he continued. Your mother insists upon your accepting Mr. Collins, while I insist upon your refusing him. Choose between us. Close quote. Elizabeth could not but smile at this conclusion, and her father continued. Open quote. I know that you could not be happy with Mr. Collins. His deficiency of sense and his conceit are such that he could not contribute to your happiness. Lizzie, I have given my permission for your refusal. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do. Close quote. Elizabeth could now rejoice at being able to give her father the assurance that she was resolved never to marry Mr. Collins, and she left the room quite happy in the certainty of her father's support. Mrs. Bennet was very far from happy on the occasion. Her husband's property was entailed away from his own children, and Mr. Collins was the nearest male heir. And now the loss of such a husband to her favorite daughter was all that could vex her in the matter. She complained bitterly of her husband's cruelty, and declared she was the most ill-used woman in England. Open quote. I am sure, said she, if I had been in Lizzie's place, I should have married him out of hand. But I am sure I shall never see her again, and nobody can tell what I suffer. But as for Mr. Collins, he is such a charming man, so good, so amiable, so polite, and so much the gentleman, and he is going to be snatched away from us. The consequence is most cruel, and he is to be married to Charlotte Lucas. I can't bear to think of it. Close quote. Mr. Collins's visit was now drawing to a close, and Mrs. Bennet was still hoping that her daughter would relent, when the Lucases themselves came to call at Longbourn to condole with Mrs. Bennet on her daughter's obstinacy. Lady Lucas began to hope that Mr. Collins might now turn his eyes towards her own daughter Charlotte, and it was soon evident that this had actually happened, for Mrs. Bennet had scarcely given him up before her friend Miss Lucas accepted him. The Bennet family were astonished. Elizabeth could not help feeling some surprise mixed with amusement. Charlotte's calm acceptance of Mr. Collins, a man whom she had once ridiculed, made her reflect on the differences of their characters and views of life. Thus ended all Mrs. Bennet's hopes, and the household was again in confusion. Mrs. Bennet offended, Elizabeth thoughtful, and Mr. Collins triumphant in a new engagement, preparing to leave them the next morning. The discussion of Mr. Collins's offer was now nearly at an end, and Elizabeth had only to suffer from the uncomfortable feelings necessarily attending it, and occasionally from some peevish allusions of her mother. As for Mr. Collins, his feelings were by this time quite subdued. And while Mrs. Bennet was venting her grief on the loss of a daughter, he was quietly consoling himself with the society of the other, and talking of nothing but his house in Hunsford, and his happiness in having so good a cousin to superintend his domestic concerns, and to make him happy in his choice. Soon after his return to Hertfordshire, the Lucases called at Longbourn to condole with Mrs. Bennet and her family, and Mrs. Lucas began directly to congratulate her friend on the prospect of a connection between their families. Mrs. Bennet was in such a rage that she could hardly speak, but as her anger gave way to tears, she soon began to lament her misfortune in being able to keep her daughter only for Mr. Collins's first offer, and having it rejected. Charlotte Lucas's engagement with Mr. Collins was soon known throughout the neighborhood. The Bennet family were astonished, and Elizabeth could not help feeling some surprise mixed with amusement. Charlotte's calm acceptance of Mr. Collins, a man whom she had once ridiculed, made her reflect on the differences of their characters and views of life. Charlotte herself was tolerably composed in her behavior, and although she plainly saw that her friends were astonished at her choice, she did not seem to expect that they should be pleased with it. In private, she told Elizabeth that she was not romantic, and never had been. She only asked for a comfortable home, and considering Mr. Collins's character, connections, and situation in life, she felt she was as well settled as most people could boast on entering the married state. Elizabeth, however, could not but be all astonishment that she should have accepted him. Yet she soon saw that Charlotte had calculated correctly. Marriage had always been her object. It was the only provision for well-educated young women of small fortune, and however uncertain of giving happiness, must be their pleasantest preservative from want. Mrs. Bennet was very much discomposed. She could not comprehend how her friend could be so taken in by such a man, or how she could have the face to wish her daughter well settled at the expense of one of her own. She was not to be comforted, and continued for some time to talk of her friend's treachery, and Mr. Collins's deceit. Mr. Bennet regarded the whole affair with the utmost composure. "For," said he, "it gratifies me to know that Charlotte Lucas, who would have been my least favorite daughter-in-law, is likely to be very happy in her domestic comforts. Mr. Collins's respectability will be preserved, and we shall at least have the satisfaction of seeing them both in good humor whenever they come to visit us." The wedding took place soon after Christmas, and the bride and bridegroom departed immediately after the ceremony for Kent. The bride was to take possession of her new home, and Elizabeth received from her a letter full of affectionate professions, and a strong desire for her to visit Hunsford soon after her settlement there. The interval of her friend's absence was filled up on Elizabeth's part by many letters from Jane, who continued at Netherfield, and by occasional visits from Mr. Wickham, whose manners recommended him so strongly to her that all her former prejudices were removed, and she found him most agreeable and intelligent. Mr. Bingley's attentions to Jane were now the universal topic among their friends. Mrs. Bennet was so much delighted with him as a son-in-law that she was quite disappointed when they did not fix on an early day for their marriage. But Jane explained to her sister that she still had doubts of his affection, and though her hopes were high, she was by no means confident of their fulfillment. The Bennet family were not long in learning that the Lucases were to spend the winter at Hunsford in Kent, and Mrs. Bennet was quite in despair. She could not imagine what Charlotte was about, and could not forgive her for such treachery toward her own sex. But the subject was so disagreeable to her that she would not mention it again. Mr. Collins's return into Hertfordshire was no longer a matter of pleasure to Mrs. Bennet. His marriage made him, in her eyes, quite another man, and she regarded him only as the clergyman of Lady Catherine de Bourgh and the future owner of Longbourn. The wedding took place soon after Christmas. The bride and bridegroom set off immediately after the ceremony, and Elizabeth was then able to see them depart with perfect composure. Her friend's happiness was her chief concern, and that she was really happy in her choice, Elizabeth sincerely hoped. In a letter which Charlotte wrote soon after her marriage, she gave her friend an account of her arrival at Hunsford and her satisfaction in her new home. The house, furniture, neighborhood, and roads were all to her taste, and Lady Catherine's kindness made everything comfortable. Elizabeth received the letter with a mixture of pleasure and pain. She was happy for the sake of her friend, yet she could not help feeling how much the pleasantness of an abode in the country and the attentions of a noble patroness could make up for the deficiency of such a companion as Mr. Collins. From the day of his marriage, Mr. Collins was a changed man. He wrote to the Bennets frequently, but his letters were now full of respect and self-congratulation. He spoke of his happiness as perfect, and his gratitude to Lady Catherine as too much for words. Every sentence conveyed the sense of his own importance and his delight in his new situation. Mrs. Bennet's resentment soon subsided, and she consoled herself with the hope that, though her own daughter had not secured him, her friend's marriage would be the means of frequently bringing them together, since the Collinses must often come to Longbourn. The Miss Lucases were invited to dine with them soon after the wedding, and brought many pleasant accounts of their sister's situation. Everything was reported as most favorable, and Mrs. Collins seemed perfectly happy. Her home was comfortable, her garden spacious, and her poultry thriving. Elizabeth listened in silence, but was not convinced. The calmness with which Charlotte bore her new situation, the cheerfulness she affected, might be very commendable, but Elizabeth could not persuade herself that they expressed real contentment. She believed that Charlotte had chosen rationally, but without happiness. About this time, Elizabeth began to expect a letter from Charlotte, inviting her to Hunsford. Every day's post brought something from her friend, describing more fully her situation, her house, and her patroness, and at length the long-expected invitation was given, with the warmest entreaties for Elizabeth's compliance, and a kind repetition of Lady Catherine's very polite request that she would favor them with a visit. Elizabeth found herself obliged to yield to the persuasion of her friend, and she wrote to Charlotte to fix the time of her coming. Mrs. Bennet was quite delighted that she should go, and expected with great eagerness that she would bring back such a full account of the grandeur of Lady Catherine and her fine house as might reconcile her to the loss of her daughter's establishment. Elizabeth was sitting with her mother and sisters, reflecting on what she had heard from Jane, when the door was opened, and the eldest Miss Lucas appeared, sent by her mother on the same errand of condolence to Mrs. Bennet and her daughters. She was received with great politeness by them all, and in return highly commended Miss Bennet's looks. Mrs. Bennet, who had been unable to contain herself while her daughter was talking to Miss Lucas, now began to abuse the man who had been the cause of all her disappointment. Open quote. "I am sure," said she, "if I had been in Jane's place, I should not have behaved so weakly. No, I should have shown him that I had a spirit. I should never have been so easily put off. I should have written to him, or to his sisters, or to his friend Mr. Darcy if he had behaved in such a way. It is all their fault. They have taken him away on purpose. I am sure they have, because they dislike us." Close quote. Mrs. Lucas endeavored to soothe her by representing the affair as a disappointment which young ladies often meet with, but Mrs. Bennet could not be comforted. "Lady Lucas," said she, "you may be very sure that I shall never speak to you again if you encourage your daughter to marry Mr. Collins." Mrs. Lucas, though shocked at the threatening, could not help laughing heartily at this display of resentment, and as soon as she possibly could, she took her leave. Elizabeth, who was not blind to the impropriety of her mother's behavior, could hardly keep her countenance as Mrs. Lucas quitted the house. Charlotte's marriage was now the general topic of conversation. Mrs. Bennet was very indignant and considered it as the most shameful thing in the world, while the younger Miss Bennets declared that they could not respect Charlotte, and Lydia thought her exceedingly foolish for accepting a man whom nobody else would have. Jane confessed herself a little surprised at the match, but she said less of her astonishment than of her wish for their happiness, and her belief that it was very suitable. Elizabeth was particularly gratified by Charlotte's marriage, because it delivered her from the importunities of Mr. Collins. The house, in consequence, became much more pleasant. Mrs. Bennet's resentment, however, was not so easily done away. The sight of Mr. Collins was odious to her, as the man who was to inherit her estate, and she could not think of his marriage without anger. A week after the Lucases' departure, Jane received letters from Caroline Bingley. They were full of professions of regard, and at the same time alluded to her brother's being soon at no great distance from the Darcy estate in Derbyshire. From the whole of his behavior, Jane was convinced that he had no intention of returning to Netherfield, and she was deeply grieved. Elizabeth could not but feel that Bingley's affection had been most unworthily disposed of, and that his friend had been the means of separating them. Mrs. Bennet was outraged beyond measure. "This is too much," cried she. "They are all against me. Everybody is determined to ruin my poor girls. Nobody cares for us. But I will take care of myself. I will go to town and see Mr. Bingley myself. He shall hear what I have to say. He shall be told how Jane is treated." Elizabeth tried to represent to her the imprudence of such a measure, but Mrs. Bennet was determined. Her husband, however, paid no attention to her scheme, and when she found that she could not prevail on him to take her to town, she had to be contented with being angry. The Bennets' disappointment was shared by all their neighbors. Mrs. Phillips joined in lamenting the matter, and even Lady Lucas was sorry for her friend. But the great consolation to Mrs. Bennet was that her own family was not the only one disappointed in marriage. She valued herself on having been so near success, and looked forward with pleasure to the possibility of seeing her two eldest daughters well settled, if not with Mr. Bingley, then with some other young men of large fortune. Miss Bingley's letter arrived, and put an end to doubt. The very first sentence conveyed the assurance of their being all settled in London for the winter, and concluded with her brother's regret at not having had time to pay his respects to his friends in Hertfordshire before he left the country. Hope was over, entirely over, and when Jane could attend to the rest of the letter, she found little, except the professed affection of the writer, that could give her any comfort. Miss Darcy was mentioned as likely to spend the winter in town, which gave some idea, though vague and indistinct, of what her brother's persuasion might be, and Elizabeth could not but feel that Jane's disappointment had been the work of Mr. Darcy's pride. They were not rich enough to visit London, but Elizabeth comforted her sister as well as she could. She represented to her that Mr. Bingley's affection had been too weak, or his resolution too easily shaken, to make any woman happy, and that if he had been sincere, he could not have been so easily persuaded to give her up. Jane, however, could not be convinced. "He has been deceived, perhaps imposed on," she said. "I shall think ill of his heart, if he is capable of such inconstancy. But I shall endeavor to think well of him, and to believe that he was only misled." Elizabeth could not but smile at such determined goodness. "You are too generous," said she, "to trifle with your own happiness. Had his friend, Mr. Darcy, been of a less arrogant nature, he might have stood his ground. But his pride and caprice will have destroyed the happiness of a most amiable woman." The subject was too painful for Jane to continue, and they soon changed to one less distressing. When the Miss Lucases next called at Longbourn, they found the Bennet family still dwelling on the same topic. Charlotte was less feelingly concerned than the others, but she soon perceived that Elizabeth was deeply affected by her sister's suffering, and she tried to make her see things more calmly. Open quote. "Depend upon it, Lizzie," said she, "that Mr. Bingley will marry where he is most attached. We all know he is a good-tempered man, but that is not enough to make a good husband. His sister's influence may have made him leave Netherfield, but if he is really fond of Jane, he will return soon." Close quote. Elizabeth shook her head. "That is very likely," she replied, "but not certain. I cannot believe that Mr. Darcy would allow it. He governs his friend entirely." Charlotte, with her usual good sense, saw things differently. "I do not think Mr. Darcy's influence would be of much account in such a case. He may influence his friend's manners, but not his heart. If Bingley is truly attached to your sister, he will come back." Elizabeth made no answer, but her thoughts were far from acquiescing. Her distrust of Mr. Darcy was too deep-rooted to be shaken by anything Charlotte could say. After this conversation, the subject was seldom mentioned between them. Elizabeth was resolved not to be drawn into any argument that might make her think less ill of Darcy. Mrs. Bennet still talked of her hopes for Jane's marriage, but the others gradually gave up the idea. Mr. Bingley's absence was lengthened beyond any expectation, and even Mrs. Bennet at last gave over all hope of his return, though she could not refrain from talking of what might have been. The Bennet family now saw little of their neighbors. Mr. Wickham was almost the only frequent visitor, and his manners, his ease, and his apparent good humor made him generally liked. He was especially attentive to Elizabeth, and she was soon convinced that his story of Darcy's cruelty was perfectly true. Every day confirmed her dislike of the man, and as Wickham related with the greatest simplicity all the hardships he had suffered from him, she thought him one of the most ill-used young men in England. When Mr. Collins and Charlotte were gone, the house at Longbourn became once more tranquil. Elizabeth looked forward to visiting her friend at Hunsford with pleasure, and Mrs. Bennet was equally eager for her to go, in hopes that she would bring back a full account of Lady Catherine's magnificence and Mr. Collins's happiness. After a week spent in professions of love and schemes of felicity, Mr. Collins and Charlotte were gone. The family was again well settled. Elizabeth and Jane had soon ceased to think of their cousin, and with mutual relief turned their thoughts to their aunt, Mrs. Gardiner, whom they expected to arrive soon after Christmas. Mrs. Gardiner was a sensible, genteel, well-informed woman, greatly superior to her sister as well by nature as by education. The Netherfield ladies would have had difficulty in believing that a woman who lived by trade, and within view of her own warehouses, could have been so well-bred and agreeable. But Mrs. Gardiner, who was several years younger than Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Phillips, was an amiable, intelligent, and elegant woman, and a great favorite with her Longbourn nieces. Between the two eldest and herself especially, there subsisted a particular regard. They had frequently been staying with her in town. The first part of Mrs. Gardner's business on her arrival was to distribute her presents and describe the newest fashions. When this was done, she had leisure to listen to the complaints of her sister, who bewailed the probability of her daughter's never getting Mr. Bingley. Open quote, "I do not blame Jane," she said, "for Jane would have got him if she could. But Lizzie, oh sister, it is very hard to think that Charlotte Lucas should ever get Mr. Collins, for nobody would have thought she could. And yet I am sure she is not half so handsome as Jane, nor half so good-humored as Lydia. But she has married him, however, and now he will always be at home with them, and they will both be of so much consequence. And the Lucases are such artful people indeed." Close quote. Mrs. Gardner smiled and replied, Open quote, "Perhaps you will not think Charlotte so very fortunate as you do now. Mr. Collins's home and his connections may make her happier than some married women, but I dare say not half so happy as some unmarried ones." Close quote. Mrs. Bennet still could not be comforted. Her husband, however, was less affected by the subject, and was very glad to have Mrs. Gardner's company, who was always pleasant and cheerful. Mrs. Gardner, after some inquiry into Jane's recent disappointment, soon discovered that she had been unjustly treated by her friends in Hertfordshire, and that she must have been very much in love. She considered it her duty to try to promote Jane's happiness. Open quote, "My dear Jane," said she, "you must come to me in London. This will be a change for you. Perhaps you will get over your disappointment there better than here. Your friends in town will not know about it, and it will give you fresh objects." Close quote. Jane readily consented, and though Mrs. Bennet at first declared she would not part with her, she was soon prevailed upon to consent to her daughter's going. Elizabeth, glad of anything that might lessen her sister's regret, rejoiced in the arrangement. She expected her aunt to write to Mr. Bingley's sisters, and hoped from their future intimacy that something might arise to promote her sister's comfort. Mrs. Gardner, however, would not encourage the idea. Open quote, "I should be sorry to think our acquaintance with them will produce any of the effects you hope for. Their pride and that of their brother will keep him from seeing Jane. I have seen too much of their disposition to expect that they will associate with us on equal terms." Close quote. Elizabeth could not help smiling at such candor, but she was very glad to find that her aunt was not deceived by the pretensions of Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst. In return for her aunt's good opinion, Elizabeth gave her the particulars of her acquaintance with Mr. Wickham. Mrs. Gardner listened with interest and concern, but did not yield implicit belief to everything that he related. Open quote, "Take care, Lizzie," said she. "That young man's manners are very engaging, but you must not be too hasty. He may not be so amiable as he appears. All that glitters is not gold. You know that the world is full of such people." Close quote. Elizabeth only laughed. "Do not be afraid, Aunt. I will take care of myself. I will not be in love if I can help it." Mrs. Gardner kissed her affectionately and replied, Open quote, "That is all I ask of you." Close quote. Mrs. Gardner's caution to Elizabeth was punctually and kindly given. It had all the appearance of disinterested goodwill, and Elizabeth was very grateful for it. She was, however, too much disposed by nature to think well of others to be easily persuaded that Wickham was less than he appeared. His manners recommended him to everybody, and whatever she had heard against him could not abate her interest in his favor. As to Jane, her anxiety for her sister was soon relieved. Jane had written to her aunt immediately after her arrival in London, but though the letter was directed to Gracechurch Street, it was many days before it was delivered, and by that time the note which she had addressed to Miss Bingley to inform her of their being in town had been already answered. The answer was cold and civil. Miss Bingley expressed her concern at having been prevented by company from waiting on her friend, and her hope that she might have the pleasure of seeing her before she left town. Jane took this as a sufficient proof that she was not wanted, and such a conclusion was not lessened by the reception she met with when she called on Miss Bingley a few days later. Her visit was returned, but in a most distant manner, and it was soon evident that they were perfectly determined to avoid any renewal of intimacy. Jane was deeply hurt, but continued, as she always did, to make the best of it, and to hope that they might meet again under happier circumstances. Mrs. Gardiner was less charitable. Open quote. "Depend upon it, my dear," said she, "that Mr. Bingley's sisters are perfectly convinced that he is not likely to marry you, and that they are anxious to keep him from being in your company." Close quote. Jane shook her head. "Whatever may be their motives, they themselves are too kind-hearted to wish me pain, and I am sure they would not behave in a manner designedly unkind." Elizabeth, who had heard all this, could only smile at her sister's good nature, but she could not share it. During the time of Jane's stay in London, Elizabeth had frequent letters from her, and always of the same tenor. Miss Bingley's civility was confined to a formal visit, and she never called again. No mention was made of seeing Mr. Bingley, and it was evident that all connection between them was at an end. Elizabeth was grieved and angry. She could not think that Bingley's affection had been weak, or that it had died easily. She suspected that his friend Darcy had been the means of separating them, and her resentment of his conduct was proportionately increased. Meanwhile, the acquaintance with Wickham continued. The intimacy between him and Elizabeth, however, did not advance. Elizabeth saw with some regret that he was beginning to transfer his attentions to Miss King, who had lately inherited a fortune of £10,000. His change of object soon made her regard him with a more critical eye. She tried to persuade herself that she was only surprised, not disappointed, but she could not help feeling that there was something mercenary in his conduct. Open quote. "A man in distressed circumstances has not time for all those elegant refinements which other people may indulge in," said Charlotte, when Elizabeth mentioned it. "If he can gain a good fortune and a comfortable home by marrying, he may be justified in doing it. He has not a right to be in love for pleasure." Close quote. Elizabeth's pride, however, revolted at this. She could not like him so well now as she had done before. She thought that his gratitude, his regard, and his interest should have made him act differently. Charlotte and Mr. Collins had now been settled some weeks at Hunsford, and Elizabeth had received from her friend an invitation to visit her there, as soon as she could leave her father and mother. Elizabeth was glad of it. She wished to see Charlotte again, and hoped that time and habit had reconciled her to her situation. Mr. Collins had written several times to Mr. Bennet, expressing his happiness in his marriage and his gratitude for the good opinion which the family had always expressed of him. He also mentioned Lady Catherine de Bourgh in every letter, and told of her condescension and affability in terms that left no doubt of his veneration for her. Elizabeth, when the invitation was renewed, accepted it. Sir William, Lucas, and Maria were to accompany her. The journey was to take place early in March, and in the meantime she saw little of Mr. Wickham. His new interest in Miss King kept him much engaged, and Elizabeth, though she tried to believe that she saw him without emotion, was not sorry to find herself free from the danger of any deeper attachment. With no greater events than these in the Longbourn family, and otherwise diversified by little beyond the walks to Meriden, sometimes dirty and sometimes cold, did January and February pass away. March was to take Elizabeth to Hunsford. She had not at first thought very seriously of going thither, but Charlotte, she soon found, was depending on the plan, and she gradually gave in to it. Her father and mother were neither of them opposed to it. Mrs. Bennet was indeed rather pleased that she should go, while Mr. Bennet was most anxious to get rid of her and her companion. He advised her to make as long a stay as she could, and at least till after Easter, to which she readily consented. As she had now accepted Charlotte's invitation, the comfort of her sister's company and the cheerfulness of a visit to London were all that could make amends for her separation from Jane. Her aunt and uncle were all kindness, and while preparing for her journey, Elizabeth often thought how much pleasanter it would be to spend such weeks with them than with Mr. and Mrs. Collins. When the day of departure came, Elizabeth was ready to enjoy the pleasure of a short visit to Gracechurch Street before her longer journey, and she had barely taken leave of her father and mother before the carriage was at the door. As they drove from Longbourn, Elizabeth's spirits were high. The distance to London was nothing when compared with what she was to go afterwards. It was merely a morning's drive, and she thought of the rest of the journey with cheerfulness, because it would give her the opportunity of seeing the countryside, and also because she expected much pleasure from being with Charlotte. The journey to London was not long, and in a few hours they arrived at Mr. Gardiner's house in Gracechurch Street. Mrs. Gardiner received her niece with the liveliest pleasure, and Elizabeth was very happy to be with her again. Elizabeth soon found that Jane's disappointment had not been forgotten. Her cheerfulness was not equal to her usual disposition, and it was evident that she still thought of Bingley with regret. Mrs. Gardiner, too, saw and pitied her niece's feelings, and sometimes she talked to Elizabeth of her hopes that time and change of place might soon lessen her sister's distress. Elizabeth readily entered into the subject, and on the first favorable opportunity said, "I have lately seen nothing of Mr. Wickham. The whole of last week he was engaged with Miss King, and almost entirely absent from Meryton." "Oh," replied Mrs. Gardiner, "he is a very interesting young man, and his manners are just what they ought to be. But I must confess myself surprised that a young woman of Miss King's fortune should be so easily captivated by him." Close quote. Open quote. "It is amazing to me," said Elizabeth, "how young ladies can have patience to be so very guarded as they are with the men who are sometimes worth pleasing. And yet I always see that whenever there is a fortune in the case, they are all overpowered by it. I cannot help wishing that he had not fixed his eyes upon her." Close quote, open quote. "It is a pity," replied her aunt, "but that will soon be over. He is a very agreeable man, and I am sorry he should be seeking a wife merely because she has money. It shows that he thinks of himself as having no better means of making his fortune. If he were prudent, he would not risk losing his character and the good opinion of all his friends by such mercenary conduct." Close quote. Open quote. "I see what you mean," said Elizabeth, "but this may be his only chance of making a suitable establishment. Miss King's uncle is very fond of her, and would no doubt give her a good portion." Close quote. Mrs. Gardiner shook her head. "I should be sorry to think so ill of him, but there is something in the story that does not quite satisfy me." Soon after this conversation, Elizabeth and her companions set out for Hunsford. Sir William Lucas and his second daughter, Maria, accompanied her, and the journey was performed in a tolerably comfortable manner. As they drew near to the village where Mr. Collins's rectory was situated, they saw in the distance the High Park walls of Rosings. It was a large and handsome stone building, standing well on rising ground, and backed by a ridge of high woody hills. When they reached Hunsford, Charlotte received them with kindness and joy. She looked well, and Elizabeth, though she had seen her friend married without a single pang of envy, could not help thinking that the house and the parsonage were exactly what they ought to be: small, neat, and comfortable. Mr. Collins welcomed them with great politeness and importance, and before they had been 2 minutes in the house, he gave them a full description of Lady Catherine de Bourgh and her mansion. He could talk of nothing else. Open quote. "Lady Catherine is a most excellent woman," he said, "and her house is the finest in the country. Her bounty and beneficence know no bounds. She has been most gracious and condescending to us. Indeed, we dine with her tomorrow evening." Close quote. Elizabeth smiled inwardly at the prospect of being introduced to this noble patroness, and prepared herself to enjoy the scene. Every object in the parsonage was neat and comfortable, and Mr. Collins appeared very happy in his domestic arrangements. The room in which the ladies sat was sunny and warm, and the view from the window showed a pretty garden, bounded by a hedge, and beyond that, the road with occasional carriages passing. Everything was tranquil and orderly, as suited the home of a clergyman. In such a state of composure, Charlotte and her visitors were sitting the next morning, when they were surprised by a visit from Lady Catherine de Bourgh's daughter, Miss de Bourgh, accompanied by her companion, Mrs. Jenkinson. The young lady was small and sickly. Her features, though not plain, were insignificant, and she spoke very little, except to Mrs. Jenkinson, who seemed wholly devoted to her. After sitting a few minutes, they left, having been scarcely 10 minutes in the room. Charlotte was highly gratified by this mark of condescension, and on the departure of the visitors, she expatiated with great earnestness on the extraordinary civility of Lady Catherine and the wealth of her daughter. Open quote. "She is a most charming young lady indeed," said Mr. Collins. "Lady Catherine herself says so, and she is undoubtedly intended by her ladyship to be united with my patron's nephew, Mr. Darcy. I am sure Lady Catherine has often spoken of it as a settled thing. Her opinion of Mr. Darcy's superior qualities is well known. She could not have bestowed her affections on a man with greater propriety." Close quote. This information, however, gave Elizabeth little pleasure. She had not been able to help suspecting that there might be some foundation for the report of their marriage, and the idea now gained some strength. But she considered it with perfect indifference. If he were so, she could only rejoice that he was preserved from the danger of any other alliance. When the party from the parsonage arrived at Rosings the next evening, they were received at the door by a fine-looking elderly woman in a richly trimmed gown, who led them into the drawing-room, where Lady Catherine was seated. Her ladyship received them civilly, though with an air of decided superiority. She was a tall, large woman with strongly marked features, which might once have been handsome. Her air was not conciliating, nor could her manners be described as affable. However, she spoke to them all with good-humored complaisance. She inquired after their families, talked of the neighborhood, and seemed disposed to be gracious, provided they were sufficiently respectful. Mr. Collins was enchanted. He could scarcely contain his joy at being in the same room with so distinguished a personage. He was in constant rapture of Lady Catherine's condescension, and could not refrain from smiling complacently at every sentence she uttered. When dinner was over and the ladies retired to the drawing-room, Lady Catherine called out, open quote, "Miss Bennet, there seems a great deal of fine lace upon your gown. I hope you do not spend your time in making it yourself." Close quote. Open quote. "No, indeed," replied Elizabeth. "I never was a great proficient in needlework." Close quote. Open quote. "Then you have been well brought up," said Lady Catherine. Your mother must have been a woman of good sense. Did she give you a good education? What is your governess's name? Close quote, Elizabeth replied that they had never had any governess. Open quote. No governess? How was that possible? 5 daughters brought up at home without a governess. I never heard of such a thing. Your mother must have been quite a slave to your education. Close quote. Elizabeth could hardly help smiling as she assured her that had not been the case. Open quote. Then, who taught you? Who attended to you? Close quote. Open quote. We always had the benefit of being together and learning from each other, said Elizabeth. Close quote. Open quote. Are any of your younger sisters out in society? Close quote. Open quote. Yes, ma'am, all. Close quote. Open quote. All? What? All 5 out at once? Very odd. The younger ones before the elder are married. Your younger sisters must be very forward. I am astonished. Had I known your mother, I should have advised her most strenuously not to allow it. Close quote. Lady Catherine continued for some time to question Elizabeth about her family, her education, and her sisters, and delivered her opinion very decidedly on every subject. Elizabeth tried not to laugh, but it was impossible not to feel how absurdly proud and dictatorial her ladyship was. When the gentlemen joined them, Lady Catherine spoke of music. She asked Elizabeth if she played and sang. Open quote, a little. Close quote. Open quote. Oh then, pray let us hear you. Play to us. Close quote. Elizabeth complied, and Lady Catherine listened for a few minutes and then began talking to Mr. Darcy's cousin in a loud voice about the management of her servants and the improvement of her poultry yard. When she finished, she said, open quote, You have a very, very pretty taste in music, Miss Bennet. Do your sisters play and sing also? Close quote. Open quote. One of them does. Close quote. Open quote. Why did not you all learn? You ought all to have learned. It is a pity you did not all take lessons. Had I known your mother, I would have advised her to do so. Close quote. Elizabeth could hardly restrain her laughter. She thanked Lady Catherine for her advice and said no more. When they returned to the parsonage, Charlotte spoke of Lady Catherine with the warmest admiration. Mr. Collins, of course, was in transports. He could talk of nothing but her ladyship's politeness and affability, and Elizabeth, tired of hearing both, was thankful that she had agreed to stay only a few weeks. Mr. Collins's triumph, in consequence of this invitation, was complete. The power of displaying the grandeur of his patroness to his wondering visitors, and of letting them see her civility toward himself and his wife, was exactly what he had wished for. And that an opportunity of doing it should be given so soon was such an instance of Lady Catherine's condescension as he knew not how to admire enough. I confess, said he, that I should not have been at all surprised by her ladyship's asking us on Sunday to drink tea and spend the evening at Rosings. I rather expected, from my knowledge of her affability, that it would happen. But who could have foreseen such an attention as this? Who could have imagined that we should receive an invitation to dine there? An invitation, moreover, including the whole party, so immediately after our arrival. I am the less surprised at what has happened, replied Sir William, from that knowledge of what the manners of the great really are, which my situation in life has allowed me to acquire. About the court, such instances of elegant breeding are not uncommon. Scarcely anything was talked of the whole day or next morning but their visit to Rosings. Mr. Collins was carefully instructing them in what they were to expect, that the sight of such rooms, so many servants, and so splendid a dinner might not wholly overpower them. When the ladies were separating for the toilette, he said to Elizabeth, open quote, Do not make yourself uneasy, my dear cousin, about your apparel. Lady Catherine is far from requiring that elegance of dress in us, which becomes herself and her daughter. I would advise you merely to put on whatever of your clothes is superior to the rest. There is no occasion for anything more. Lady Catherine will not think the worse of you for being simply dressed. She likes to have the distinction of rank preserved." Close quote. While they were dressing, he came 2 or 3 times to their different doors to recommend their being quick, as Lady Catherine very much disliked to be kept waiting for her dinner. Such formidable accounts of her ladyship and her manner of living quite frightened Maria Lucas, who had never been at such a place before. Charlotte's calmness, however, carried her through it all, and Elizabeth, to suit her own feelings, chose to make sport of her fears. When the carriage drove up to the door, they found Lady Catherine's carriage waiting for them, which Mr. Collins, in great delight, insisted on their making use of, and the whole party soon found themselves in the grand saloon at Rosings. Their ladyship's guests were few. The principal visitors were her nephews, Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam. Elizabeth was struck with surprise at the sight of Mr. Darcy, and the surprise was mixed with a certain sense of pleasure and confusion, which, though natural, she would not have acknowledged for the world. Her cousin, on the other hand, was enraptured. He greeted Mr. Darcy with the greatest respect, and was beyond measure delighted at the honor of being personally known to such a man. The colonel, who came with him, was about 30 years old, not handsome, but in person and address most truly the gentleman. His manners were easy and pleasant, and his conversation soon made Elizabeth feel perfectly at ease with him. Lady Catherine was gracious and attentive to her guests, and spoke to Darcy and the colonel as if she considered their presence as adding greatly to the splendor of her table. Dinner was exceedingly handsome, and there were all the servants and pomp which Mr. Collins had promised. When the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room after dinner, Elizabeth found herself in a situation of some awkwardness. Lady Catherine spoke to her twice, but did not seem disposed to be more affable than usual. Miss de Bourgh said nothing at all, and Mrs. Jenkinson could only add a few timid remarks on the weather. When the gentlemen joined them, Colonel Fitzwilliam entered into conversation with Elizabeth with great readiness, and their talk soon made the rest of the company seem dull in comparison. Lady Catherine observed it and called out to him, open quote, "What is that you are saying, Fitzwilliam? What is it you are talking of? What are you telling Miss Bennet? Let me hear what it is." Close quote. Open quote. "We are speaking of music, madame," said he, when no longer able to avoid a reply. Close quote. Open quote. "Of music? Then pray speak aloud. It is of all subjects my delight. I must have my share in the conversation if you are speaking of music. There are few people in England, I suppose, who have more true enjoyment of music than myself, or a better natural taste. If I had ever learnt, I should have been a great proficient, and so would Anne, if her health had allowed her to apply. I am confident that she would have performed delightfully. How does Georgiana get on, Darcy?" Close quote. Mr. Darcy spoke with affection of his sister's progress. Open quote. "I am very glad to hear such a good account of her," said Lady Catherine, "and pray tell her from me that she cannot expect to excel if she does not practice a great deal." Close quote. Open quote. "I assure you, madam," he replied, "that she does not need such advice. She practices very constantly." Close quote. Open quote. "So much the better. It cannot be done too much, and when I next write to her, I shall charge her not to neglect it on any account. I often tell young ladies that no excellence in music is to be acquired without constant practice. I have told Miss Bennet several times that she will never play really well unless she practices more. And though Mrs. Collins has no instrument, she is very welcome, as I have often told her, to come to Rosings every day and play on the pianoforte in Mrs. Jenkinson's room. She would be in nobody's way, in that part of the house. Close quote. Mr. Collins was all gratitude, and Elizabeth was amused and diverted. Lady Catherine's attention to her guests was marked by a kind of dictatorial good nature, and though she was not a woman of mean understanding, her arrogance and self-importance made her thoroughly ridiculous. When they had all taken their leave, Mr. Collins could not express his sense of Lady Catherine's politeness in terms warm enough to satisfy himself. He described the evening as one of the happiest of his life, and declared that the condescension with which her ladyship had honored them exceeded everything he had ever met with.